Welcome to this live stream from On the World, windowsontheworld.net. We do a news show usually on a Sunday evening at 8 p.m. GMT. Sometimes, though, it's on a Monday. And do let me know what you think of that timing, 8 p.m. GMT Sunday or 8 p.m. GMT on a Monday, because recently I've preferred doing the shows on a Monday because it gives me more time to get information ready. But tonight, yes, we're going to look about the whole scenario of the King Arthur legend and myth. And this has been used for so many different stories. And we're going to look at the origin of those stories and where the actual myth came from. And the myth seems to go back much further than we think. So I'm going to be talking about that during this stream. Just want to make sure everything's okay. Yes, all seems to be fine and working live. So make sure we don't get any feedback there. But I've been looking over the past few days into the King Arthur legends, and this has been at the back of my mind and indeed the forefront of my mind for many years, because the King Arthur story is attached to so many different things and really up to the point of absolute absurdity. And my view is that it's actually used to cover up real history. And I know that we've heard of King Arthur possibly existing, but we're going to get into that as well tonight, because I've interviewed the authors who do put forward these theories, and we're going to be talking about that also. So yes, the Holy Grail, Excalibur, the Round Table, Camelot, all of this is mythology. How much of it is actually based on any reality? Who are the beneficiaries of the legend of King Arthur? Well, we can look at Freemasonic interests here, especially Templar Freemasonry. The Templars had a great deal to gain out of a warrior legend, a great king who would rise and lead the Britons, because of course, with their wars in the Middle East and their conquests and their usury and their banking, they needed a figure such as King Arthur to actually give them some good publicity. And this was one of the things that got me really interested in the Arthur story, actually. It was an interview I did many years ago with Ralph Ellis, and that made me look further into how the Templar Freemasons had actually incorporated the Arthur story and how it's very important as a kind of driving mechanism for this idea of the warrior knight hero, and also the idea that Arthur may once again rise and lead the Britons to victory, kind of hopium. And of course, we can compare that with the sort of hopium and the characters that we have now. There's no difference, really. So there's a lot of romanticism around this story, and it is just a story. And there is very little circumstantial evidence to say that there was actually a King Arthur. Now, I know people refer to the work of Blackett and Wilson, but I went into that with Adrian Gilbert, who wrote the book Holy Kingdom, and you can see an interview I did with Adrian called The Real King Arthur. But I went through the book and I went through a lot of this stuff that said there was an Arthur around the 6th century, and there's nothing very compelling there. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial evidence, remember, is used to convict innocent people. So we have to be very careful with circumstantial evidence. So I'm going to go back even further to start with. This is a quote from L. Sprague de Camp, and I just pulled it off a website before I came on air tonight. And this is about the legend of King Arthur. The name is that not of a mortal man, but of a god. The pre-Christians worshipped a god called Artur by the Irish and Ateus by the Gauls. The name has been variously connected with words for to plough, Latin arare, which makes him a god of agriculture, and for bear, the Greek arctos, which makes him a bear god, for black, which makes him a raven god, and so on. Now, this is the sort of stuff, the rabbit hole, I really don't like going into, but it's an example of how far this could actually go back. So we're talking really about an archetype a sort of universal archetype that is given to the people as a hero. And that's, to me, what is the whole essence of this story. And of course, it was used by Edward I and Edward VII. And they both thought that the Arthur story was very good PR, because Edward I, when he conquered the Welsh, even had a round table for his knights. So this story is embedded in the consciousness of people. So therefore it is archetypal, because archetypes have to be embedded within our psyche so we believe them. That's what I found most interesting about this story. Anyway, it goes on this website to say, in any case, Arthur is like many other heroes, merely a pagan god transformed into a fictional mortal with the deeds of some real men attributed to him. Now, that is actually a very good quote. I like that, very concise. And I think that does sum it up. I'm going to give you something even broader now before we get into the realities of where the Arthur stories come from. This is from The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain by William Comyns Beaumont. And he's quoting from an author called Spence. King Arthur and Osiris were derived from one original. Arthur and Osiris are indeed figures originating in a common source and must be reasonably clear to the student of myth. Well, of course they are, aren't they? Druidism is only the cult of Osiris in another form, and Arthur seems to have a common origin with Osir or Osiris. Apart from esoteric resemblances between the Philistines and the legendary King Arthur, there are similes in more material pursuits. And Beaumont then goes on to say, the Philistines were governed by aristocratic chiefs who stood in the position of feudal lords and might be acclaimed as the originators of the code of chivalry, for they, like King Arthur's bold knights, possessed an order of knight errantry. They even used the title Sir for the 5 Philistine lords, and they were called Seren, the plural for Sir, admittedly of the same race as the Carini or the Carians, to whom I have referred previously as dwelling in the northwestern Scotland and the Isles. This people, says Herodotus, were the first to fasten crests on helmets, put devices on their shields, and were a great maritime people in the time of Minos, as the Philistines undoubtedly were in the reign of Solomon. So that's very typical Comyns Beaumont. He's given you tons of information in one paragraph. But I think that gives you some idea of how far this archetype goes back. And of course, we had other warrior knights. We've got Derfel Gadarn in Wales, of course, the warrior who turned into a kind of philosophical figure and was a healer of the local people. And this is all very interesting when we start looking at especially the Brythonic and the Welsh mythology, which we're going to be doing in this show. So yes, the possible origin of the first Arthurian stories. Now, the figure of King Arthur, or Arthur, because the character is not always a king. Sometimes he's referred to as a leader of men. So when we say King Arthur, we're not always talking about someone who was actually a king. It says the figure of Arthur first appeared in Welsh poetry in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. He was a hero who was said to lead the Britons in battle against the Saxon invaders, but it wasn't until the 12th century that he was first tied to parts of the British Isle, and especially Tintagel. And there's a good reason why we didn't hear anything really about King Arthur before the 12th century. And that is because of the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth and the French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who actually wrote the King Arthur stories. So the King Arthur stories were actually written by a Frenchman, and they were then incorporated into the later Mabinogion, which is the Welsh stories. But there are stories online which refer to the Arthur story, saying that there was this oral tradition with the name Arthur, but he was not necessarily referred to as King Arthur. So that leaves it very vague again. So the story is used for archetypes, and I believe the story is used for definite outcomes. And from my research, which is why I wanted to do this show, I've found that these cover stories often cover up history. I am very much of the belief that Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea visited Britain, and the church in Glastonbury at 30 AD, I do believe to be real. However, what we get is the layers of the King Arthur story put onto Glastonbury. And of course, in the 12th century, we had the story coming out of the Glastonbury Abbey. The monks were saying they'd found the bones of King Arthur. Well, there's no evidence that they were the bones of King Arthur, but they were reputed to be of a giant. And there's other stories, of course, where we get these pieces of evidence, but they disappear. The lock of hair that was meant to be found to prove the existence of King Arthur, well, it turned into dust as soon as it was exposed to the air. All these are really tall tales, and they were there for a purpose, to drive people in a certain direction and give people a certain belief system. So I find this very interesting. Also, of course, hopium. Hopium. It's a bit like the Trump thing, isn't it? King Arthur, hopium. And the thing is with the Arthur myth is, of course, that it was hundreds of years after the existence of anyone who could have been called Arthur. This is the point, that the stories didn't appear for at least 300 years. So, yes, whether there were kings called Arthur is of actually no importance to the PR machine of the Arthur legend and the Arthur story. And the thing about it is that it's got more watered down as time goes on. So you get people writing more and more stuff, which is based in the first instance on a legend, a myth, a story. And then people repeat these things as though they're true. And that's where they can be used by organizations and secret societies to cover up the real truth, of course. And then we get connections to all these places like Roslin Chapel and the Templar Freemasonry, the Holy Grail. It all starts to look like a big steering mechanism. And of course, we have to try and see beyond that. And it's there to obscure the real history. So we'll talk first about the French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who got his ideas for the Arthur stories from Geoffrey of Monmouth and his History of the Kings of Britain. Now, the History of the Kings of Britain is fascinating, but it's done with, at best, artistic license. So what we can say about the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, it is that it's based on a certain amount of artistic license and propaganda. So we've also got the Welsh mythology in the Historia Britonum and the Annal Cambrian, the Annals of Cambria, set in the 6th century, but written in the 12th century. Now, the earliest mention of any Arthur was in the 9th century in the wars of Wales and Mercia. So we get somebody called Arthur who's related to the wars of Wales and Mercia. So we actually get somebody who's got a name that is a bit like Arthur when it is actually revealed. So we're going to get into that. So the History of the Britons story actually goes from AD 29 onwards. And what we get is war propaganda from the kings of Gwynedd. So that is the Welsh version of the story, which is the Cambrian Annals. And the History of the Britons they describe as being from AD 29 onwards. So it's stories which relate into the Bible stories. And then we get this war propaganda, which was really for the kings of Gwynedd repelling the English. So there's a mention of a leader, and he's not a king, he's called Arthur, who fought the Saxons. So there was mention of somebody, a war leader called Arthur, who fought with the Saxons, but there is no information on this person, no biography, and no backstory whatsoever, just the mention of a name. So Then we go again to the Welsh side of things, the Agodadin, the Agodadin. It's got two D's, which is a the. And they're 9th and 10th century stories. And this manuscript, it dates to the 13th century with rewrites. Now, this is a very important point too, that a lot of the Arthurian legend of the 12th century was rewritten later. So it refers to around the 6th century, but it was written in the 12th century, but much of the writing was actually later. So we get these abridged versions of previous stories. And that's where it all starts to get really woolly. Yeah, I've been looking into it a lot over the past couple of days. So this manuscript, the Agodadin, it dates to the 13th century. It's written in Middle Welsh and Old Welsh. So obviously, it could be from different time periods. It's a series of elegies to the men of the Brittonic kingdom of Gododin and its allies. So I think this is the area which is now called Gwynedd. I'm not absolutely sure on that. But it's about the allies who died fighting the Angles of Deira and Bernicia at a place named Catraeth in about 600 AD. So we're going back to 600 AD again. It is traditionally ascribed to the bard Aneurin, that's his name, and survives only in one manuscript, the Book of Aneurin from the 13th century. And the reference that they say is to Arthur in this book is Gwarther. So we don't get a reference to Arthur. We get a reference to someone called Gwarther, Welsh, Gwarther. That's Gwarddur, Gwarther, probably Gwarther. And it says Gwarther was no Arthur. So that's the only reference we get in the Gododin. Now we go to the Geoffrey of Monmouth, the 11th century, the history of the kings of Britain. And remember that Chrétien, the French writer who was really famous and made the stories of King Arthur famous, dates back to the 12th, 13th century. So Chrétien de Troyes was really the one who popularized the King Arthur stories. Camelot, Lancelot, the Round Table. He was a French poet known for his writings on Arthurian subjects such as Gawain, Lancelot, Percival, and he introduced the Holy Grail. Very interesting. Now, as we know, Edward I held a round table when he defeated the Welsh. So the King Arthur legend is very useful for the upholding of monarchy, the right of kingship, the divine right of kingship. So as a steering mechanism, King Arthur was great for the kings. And it didn't matter whether it was the kings of Wales or the kings of England, because Edward I defeated the Welsh and then he held his own round table. In other words, well, King Arthur is a little bit like me. In fact, could have been based on me. So we see this sort of thing. Now, I want to bring you up to date with something that's just been released. The Suite Vulgate de Merlin, which was originally written around 1230. Now, somebody has just found a copy of this in an old register because it wasn't really considered to be worthy at the time. So they've used it as the covering for another book. And this is quite an interesting find. But again, it dates, they say, around 1230. He says, we don't know who wrote the text. We think it was probably a collaborative exercise. Well, that's just the sitting on the fence of the academic world, which we see all the time. The Suite Vulgate de Merlin tells us about Arthur's early reign, his relationship with the Knights of the Round Table, and his heroic fight with the Saxons, again, going back to the old Welsh history. It really shows Arthur in a positive light. Of course it does. He's this young hero who marries Guinevere, invents the Round Table, and has a good relationship with Merlin, his advisor. So we've got to remember that Merlin was a boy. He was a boy who, in one of the Arthurian stories, was going to be sacrificed. It was going to be a human sacrifice, and he talked his way out of it. So There's so many layers of this. This came up in the show I did with Adrian Gilbert, and I think it's part of his book, The Holy Kingdom, which he wrote with Blackett and Wilson. And of course, they propounded a theory of an Arthur, and this was all going back to 400 and 600 AD, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a long time since I've looked at that stuff. But again, it's all about this circumstantial evidence. In other words, you start with the King Arthur legend and you find some evidence to support it. And that is really what I've found to be the case with the investigations into Arthur as a real figure. Whereas, to reiterate, the stories of Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus being in Glastonbury and around Devon and the tin mines in Cornwall, they resonate much more. I know it's the same thing in a way, circumstantial bits of evidence, but I think the Arthur thing has been used to cover up a lot, and especially with Glastonbury, because the monks at Glastonbury Abbey were definitely spinning a yarn on that one. We'll get into that as we go along. So yeah, we get the story of the Holy Grail, and this is in this book which has just been found, and it's the Suite Vulgate de Merlin, and it was written around 1230. So getting back to that, they said the sequel was vital in bringing together the entire Arthurian cycle, including the Holy Grail narrative. So this was obviously a popular text at one time for it to have been discarded so easily. The fragment includes scenes where Merlin appears as a blind harpist, mysteriously vanishes, and later returns as a bald child, giving orders to King Arthur without wearing clothes. In other words, he returns naked. In another part, Merlin is said to be the son of a woman impregnated by the devil. Now, this is interesting because this idea that Merlin was this orphan, and they, in some of the Arthurian stories, they do portray him as like a child sacrifice or someone who's evil, yet he becomes an advisor and a bit of a mystic in some of the Arthurian stories. So we're talking again about archetypes here, and those archetypes can be good or bad in the story. So in other words, the King Arthur and the Merlin, the Round Table, Guinevere, Lancelot, the knights, etc., Camelot, these are all plot devices. If we look at it in terms of story, they're plot devices. And if you were making a movie, you would need these characters, but you'd have to know these characters. And unfortunately, we get no insight into who Arthur really was. We don't get an insight into his true character. We don't get things from his point of view in the respect that there's a backstory, his life experience, what he's really like. And that to me is the problem with this. It's kind of surface. So it says that, yes, in another part of this story, this thing that's just been found about Merlin, they said the king agrees for Merlin to carry Arthur's battle standard, and Merlin returns with a fire-breathing dragon. Now, this goes into what we talked about in that interview with Adrian Gilbert, and he talked of the two dragons, that Merlin was going to be sacrificed, and he talked his way out of it, because the reason for the sacrifice was that they couldn't build in a certain place. So Merlin turns around and says, you can't build there because there's a stream under here and everything's going to actually get eroded. And he said, the other reason you can't build here is there are two dragons down there, but I can slay them for you. He gets out of it like that. But there's the red dragon and there's the white dragon. So the red dragon is associated with red and gold. The white dragon is associated with white or silver. So there we have the mythical battle of the dragons. And this can be seen as the battle between the Welsh and the English, the battle between the dark and the light. And we can even see it in the City of London, being the financial capital of the world. And they're presenting themselves as basically the city of the dragon. So this all ties in to the Arthurian stuff, especially with the City of London, because they're really into the Grail theory. You see that in quite a lot of churches. And from 1700s, we get the Templar Freemasonry, which incorporated this idea of the King Arthur story. And if you remember, there was a Wetherspoons in the City of London called the Knights Templar. And that did have a lot of pictures of King Arthur in there. I think it's gone now. But it says an intriguing sequel to the tale of Merlin has sat unseen within the bindings of an Elizabethan deeds register for nearly 400 years. Researchers have finally been able to reveal it with cutting-edge techniques. That's to give you that backstory there. It's the only surviving fragment of a lost medieval manuscript telling the tale of Merlin and the early heroic years of King Arthur's court. Yes. And in it, the magician becomes a blind harpist, and he's also a shapeshifter. Merlin becomes a shapeshifter whose powers apparently stem from being the son of a woman impregnated by the devil. So here again, we get this idea that Merlin could be the sacrifice because he's inherently evil. So we've got this idea here, which may have been brought in through the church, you see. This could have been brought in through the Christian church, not the real Christian church, of course, but the Roman church, the post-Constantine Roman church, which would have a vested interest in using these myths to portray these mystics and these people of pagan origin as evil. So that's another really good point. So yeah, the shape-shifting Merlin, whose powers apparently stem from being the son of a woman impregnated by the devil, asks to bear Arthur's standard, his coat of arms, on the battlefield. The king agrees, and Merlin is destined to turn up with a handy secret weapon, it says, a magic fire-breathing dragon. So this fragment is 400 years old, and it's another version of the Arthur story. And so they said that this particular fragment is 700 years old, and it's an old French manuscript, and there are less than 40 copies in the world, and it has been discovered by an archivist in Cambridge University Library, folded and stitched into the binding of the 16th century register. So that's just to bring you up to date with the stories that are still coming out. So yes, in Welsh sources, Arthur is portrayed as a leader of the post-Roman Britons in battles against the Anglo-Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries. He first appears in two early medieval historical sources that we've named, the Annal of Cambria and the Historia Britonum. But these date to 300 years after he is supposed to have lived. So 940 AD is the first time we get the legend of Arthur, the name of Arthur, actually written into anything. That's what they've discovered. It's after 940 AD. And most historians who study the period do not consider him a historical figure, which does, of course, not mean that he wasn't a historical figure. So his name also occurs in early Welsh poetic sources, such as what we've mentioned previously, a Gododdin, and the character developed through Welsh mythology, appearing either as a great warrior defending Britain from human and supernatural enemies, or as a magical figure of folklore, sometimes associated with the Welsh other word Annwn. The legendary Arthur developed as a figure of international interest, largely through the popularity, as we've said, of Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful, it says here, I think this is from Wikipedia, fanciful and imaginative 12th century Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. And Geoffrey depicted Arthur as a king of Britain who defeated the Saxons and established a vast empire. So many elements and incidents that are now an integral part of the Arthurian story do appear in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Britain, including, this is where we get, of course, the father of Arthur, Uther Pendragon, who's actually portrayed as another character. So this is interesting because Uther Pendragon is also portrayed as another person. So it's almost as if the names are kind of important, but the backstory of these people isn't. They appear again as archetypes. Of course, Merlin, Arthur's wife Guinevere, and Excalibur. Now, the Excalibur story is said to have originated 500 years later. So by the time that Chrétien de Troyes was writing, we had Excalibur. The original early Arthur stories, it is believed, did not have Excalibur. And of course, then we jump forward to the 14th century to the Welsh Mabinogion, which starts off with the story of the Lady in the Lake, where Lancelot keeps going back to this lake, and the lady in the lake is holding Excalibur. It's a kind of interesting story, that, but it opens up the compendium of stories, which is known as the Mabinogion. We're going to get into that a bit later too. I've got some notes on that. So yes, it says many elements and incidents that are now an integral part of the Arthurian story, including Arthur's conception at Tintagel, his final battle against Mordred at Camlan, and his final rest in Avalon, which they say, of course, is modern day Glastonbury. Whereas I think in the Holy Kingdom, they're saying that it's Caerleon in Wales. But of course, this is all just legend. I found this story interesting, the King Arthur legends, but for some reason, I don't know about you, let me know in the chat what you think, it didn't really grab me for some reason. And I couldn't really put my finger on why. And I think it's because there's no backstory. There's no backstory of Arthur, that he was a real king. Whereas if we go to the historical register of kings, we can find that there was a lot of mythology attached to kingship at the time. But we can see through that mythology because we've got a historical timeline. But of course, with Arthur, we haven't got that. So yeah, let's get on to now the 12th century French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who added Lancelot and the Holy Grail, you see. So Lancelot and the Holy Grail were added in the 12th century with this romantic, chivalrous storytelling of this Frenchman. And he began the genre of Arthurian romance that became a significant strand of medieval literature, again influencing the Welsh Mabinogion. So here we have this early idea of 600 AD, the Arthur of this time, who's not represented until 940 AD in writing, and then expanded upon on the 12th through the 1200s into the 1400s, which is when the Mabinogion, I think, was appearing and was being written. So yes, they got this story that began the genre of the Arthurian romance, these French stories, the narratives focus and shift from Arthur himself to the other characters, such as the various knights of the Round Table, who we're all familiar with. The themes, events, and characters of the Arthurian legend vary widely from text to text, and there is no canonical version. So there's no way of authenticating anything within the mythology. There is no way of doing that. So Arthurian literature thrived during the Middle Ages, but waned in the centuries that followed until it experienced a major resurgence in the 19th century. In the 21st century, the legend continues to have prominence, not only in literature, but also in adaptations for theatre, film, television, comics, and other media. So there you go. That's the potted history of where we are with it. So modern Arthur stories that we get now are all over the place. They mix it all up, and the story changes according to the subject, as indeed it always has. So we then get to another king who planted the Arthur story in Somerset. King Edgar of Somerset planted the Arthur story in Somerset. So here we get the Arthur story of Glastonbury, and Glastonbury Abbey being dug up in the 12th century. So here's the story of that. In 1191, the monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have found the grave of Arthur at Glastonbury. Now, at this particular period of time, the monasteries were making up stories, and Glastonbury Abbey and its stories are indeed quite legendary, meaning probably not true. So it says here we have an eyewitness account that was recorded by Gerald of Wales. Now the body of King Arthur was found in our own days at Glastonbury, deep down in the earth and encoffined in a hollow oak between two stone pyramids. Two parts of the tomb, to wit, the head were allotted to the bones of the man, while the remaining third contained the bones of a woman. There was found a yellow tress of woman's hair, still retaining its colour and flesh and freshness, but when a certain monk snatched it and lifted it with a greedy hand, it straightway fell into dust. How convenient for the story. That always happens, doesn't it? Always happens. The bones of Arthur were so huge, they say, that his shank bone, when placed against the tallest man in the place, reached a good 3 inches above his knee. The eye socket was a good palm in width. There were 10 wounds or more, all of which were scarred over, save one larger than the rest, which had made a great hole. So we don't know whose these bones were. And we've got to remember there were a lot of tall people around, even in those times. I mean, Edward I was pretty tall, I think. Longshanks, wasn't it? So when we look at all this, we got the bones of a tall soldier were found in Glastonbury Abbey, and allegedly a lock of hair which fell into dust. That doesn't sound credible at all to me, actually. But Edward I reinforced this legend, of course. It was very good for him. So here we have to look at it in terms of the use of the Arthurian legend as a great PR for the monarchy. Yes, so as we've said so far, the history of the kings of England by Geoffrey of Monmouth was embellished and very romanticized. And it was actually translated from the Brut de Cilio. And I think that's mentioned in that interview I did with Adrian Gilbert. And we talked about the Brut de Cilio, which was the foundation document for the stories of the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, of course, we can't say that what Geoffrey was saying wasn't entirely true. And we can't say it was all made up. We can't say that there was stuff in there that wasn't real, you know. So this is the point about it, that with the legend stuff, it's very important to look at whether there's a backstory, yeah. So yeah, so this is about Chrétien de Troyes, because he was really the person, as we've said, who popularized the King Arthur stories. And it says little is known of his life. He apparently frequented the court of Marie, the Comtesse de Champagne, and he may have visited England. Bit vague, isn't it? His tales, written in the vernacular, followed the appearance in France of Wace's Roman de Brut in 1155, a translation again of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Britain, which introduced Britain and the Arthurian legend to continental Europe. So we've already been through that. Chrétien's romances were imitated almost immediately by other French poets and were translated and adapted frequently during the next few centuries as the romance continued to develop as a narrative. Eric, for example, this is the title, supplied some of the material for the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Great Knight. So we find these Arthur stories seem to go all over the place, and they're incorporated into so much, aren't they? Okay, so we've been through Geoffrey of Monmouth, and it chronicles this is the history of the kings of Britain, chronicles the lives of these kings of Britain over the course of 2,000 years. It's a very, very extensive piece of work, and it chronicles the lives of the kings of the Britons, with their beginning with the Trojans founding the British nation. So this really is fascinating for people who are interested in the work of William Comyns Beaumont, such as myself, obviously. And it says it continues until the Anglo-Saxons. So that's where we get the later stories. So the stories of King Arthur, really, that we get from the 6th and 7th centuries were when the Anglo-Saxons were fighting in Britain. And it's just the Anglo-Saxons assumed control of much of Britain around the 7th century. It is one of the central pieces of the matter of Britain. So then we get to the Mabinogion, which is 14th century, really. And the Mabinogion means tales from a boy's youth, which is quite vague, really, isn't it? It's a collection of the earliest Welsh prose stories. So it's a compilation, and it was compiled in the 12th to 13th centuries from the earlier oral traditions. And it includes the prophecies of the boy Merlin, and it's built on some historical stories, and it's given this supernatural air, which was very popular at the time. And of course, 1400s, the age of chivalry, And then when we get into the 1500s, we're approaching the age of reason. So we go from this romantic era into this age of reason. And of course, now we're into this new age, and it's all been resurrected and even more thinned out and used as a cover story, which is the problem I have with a lot of it these days. So yes, the red dragon versus the white dragon, and someone's just put something in chat there about that. Red gold versus white silver dragon makes me think of alchemy. Yes, well, of course, the alchemical writings were all about legend. They incorporated legend, and that's again where the whole thing can go on and on and on and on. And again, the problem I found when I wanted to relate it to real history. Great. Thank you, Bitcoin mining. Thank you very much. I am keeping an eye on this. I don't want to get distracted, though, because I like to keep these shows tight. The reason I do these shows in such a way is so you can listen to them again and then do your own research. They're like a base for research. So you can go off and think, oh, I'll have a look into that. And the reason I wanted to do this King Arthur show, particularly at the present moment, was because I was watching those interviews I did that I mentioned, one with Ralph Ellis, one with Adrian Gilbert. And I found that although there's some compelling stuff in there, it's circumstantial, it's interesting, it ties into a bigger picture, but we have to put the whole thing in perspective as a myth and a legend. And what's it really used for? And that to me is the most interesting thing. What's the story being used for? What's the outcome? What do people actually want to gain by putting this stuff out there? Because we have to think of that. I mean, not all people want to put stories out there just because they're stories. When we get into the King Arthur thing, I think the Freemasons have used it to cover up a lot of stuff. It's always been mentioned. I've got some stuff from Freemasonic websites, actually, I'm going to read out. And so it's legend and PR. That was what was my next note. Yes, very, very important. And of course, the Arthurian legend, what we're talking about 1200s, it coincides with the formation of the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar needed a figure such as King Arthur as the cover for their activities. So there's no coincidence that we get this profusion of stories and the Knights Templar at the same time. So the King Arthur stories and the Knights Templar intertwine. Very, very important point that. The pulling of the sword from the stone, the symbolic pulling of the sword from the stone. Of course, this was a much later idea. And it also, again, reinforced the divine right of kingship. So in other words, anybody could have a go at pulling the sword out of the stone, but only the chosen person could actually really do it. It's a prototype image for the Knights Templar being true, worthy, trustworthy knights. And that was where I found the Arthur story really made sense to me. The Poor Knights of Christ, the Knights Templar. Oh, I'm going to get into something from a book that I was putting together and I'm still putting together. It's going to be out soon, actually. The provisional title for it is the Anti-Globalist Handbook. And it's all about the present system. And I've been putting it together for quite a few years. But I went into a lot of history and I've now put it into different sections, which will be different audio books. So this is actually from the research I did about the Poor Knights of Christ, the Knights Templar, who of course came along, about the Knights Hospitallers, and the Knights Hospitallers, after the Templars were disbanded, basically incorporated the funds of the Knights Templar. So they should be more adequately described as the rich knights of the Money Temple, of course. Their brilliance lay in their organized ability to trade and fight wars in the Holy Land. So after the Christian armies in 1099 captured Jerusalem from Muslim control during the Crusades, these pilgrims went from Western Europe visiting the Holy Land, and it was the Knights Templars' job to make sure they were safe. And of course, they were carrying gold and they issued promissory notes for the gold. This is one of the early origins of usury. So the City of London and the Knights Templar are inextricably linked. And of course, with the Arthurian legend, you see a lot of this around the city of London. So, however, many pilgrims, you see, were being robbed and killed as they crossed through the Muslim-controlled territories. And in 1118, a French knight, cover story, Hugh de Payenne, created the military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances. I think we can see through that, calling it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Later, of course, simply known as the Knights Templar. With support of Baldwin II, the ruler of Jerusalem at the time, they set up headquarters on the Temple Mount, from which they took their name, and they pledged to protect Christian visitors to Jerusalem. Now, the Knights Templar weren't all that successful in their battles, but they brought this age of chivalry to the British people. In other words, these foreign wars are worth it. We are taking back the original Holy Land. So this Holy Land story has been going on a long time. And of course, if we go back to Constantine, we can look through the work of Comyns Beaumont at the creation of the Holy Lands, the recreation of the Holy Lands. So present day Israel was created, well, of course, in 1948. And that particular area could have been Constantine's decoy. So this is what I find interesting about it all. So in 1129, the Knights Templar received the formal endorsement of the Catholic Church. That's really important, isn't it? And support from Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a prominent French abbot. Bernard authored in praise of the Knights Templars, and a text that supported the Knights Templars he wrote, and it bolstered their growth. So the Knights Templar was basically promoted through the Roman Church. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull that allowed the Knights Templar special rights. Among them, the Templars were exempt from paying taxes, permitted to build their own oratories, and held no one's authority except the Pope's. By 1303, the Knights Templar lost its foothold in the Muslim world and established a base of operations in Paris. This is where it turns bad for them. King Philip of France resolved to bring down the order, perhaps because the Templars had denied the indebted ruler additional loans. So King Philip the Fair, as they called him, he had actually taken out loans from the Knights Templar, and they didn't want to lend him any more money. And on Friday, October 13th, 1307, see, this all ties in with the time of the King Arthur stories. Scores of French Templars were arrested, including the order's Grand Master Jacques de Molay. Many of the knights were brutally tortured until they confessed to false charges. So the alternative history describes the knights being warned of the raid and being allowed to escape, which is much more credible. So basically, there was a few people who were the scapegoats. So they put Jacques de Molay up there because he was well known. He was a scapegoat. So is there any difference to that and what's happened recently in the UK courts? No. Scapegoats are always put up there for the public as a hate figure to cover up what's going on underneath. Keep the public happy. A few years later, dozens of Templars were burned at the stake in Paris for their confessions, and Jacques de Molay was executed in 1314. So it says, later, under pressure from King Philip, Pope Clement V reluctantly dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312. Did he really? Probably only on the face of it, because, of course, they still exist in Switzerland and the City of London, because the Templar money went to Switzerland. There's so much rubbish about the Knights Templar have as many legends and stories attached to them as King Arthur, which is why they both intertwine so well, I think. The group's property and monetary assets were given to a rival order, the Knights Hospitallers. Not really a rival order at all. However, it's thought that King Philip and King Edward II of England seized most of the Knights Templars' wealth. They probably got some of it, but when we look at what happened in Switzerland later, the setting up of the cantons and the banking industry, and when we look at the City of London, This is where we have to look for the Knights Templar. What happened to the Knights Templar? And of course, Malta and the Knights of Malta. So they're the organization which incorporated the Templars into this world organization of poor knights of the money temple who controlled finance and still have influence throughout the world and in government and beyond. Well, look, anybody who is going to get pushed, even the useful idiots, people who are put into power, are Knights of Malta, and they have regular meetings in London. And of course, Malta is one of the biggest money laundering islands on the planet. Probably more money goes through Malta than even the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man's one of the biggest. But Malta is really the home of the Knights Templar. Of course, the Knights Templar actually docked at Malta because they were being pursued by the Muslims. So a lot of this is interesting. Where did the Templar gold go? Well, Switzerland, Malta, and we see it in the setting up of the banking system. So described as a sovereign military hospitaller order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta. That is what the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta, are. The Knights of Malta are the sovereign military hospitaller order, obviously hospitaller because they were incorporated into the Hospitallers, the Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, better known as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. The Knights Templar have got so many different names. Just call them the poor Knights of the Money Temple and you'll be on the money, literally. So they are actually a Roman Catholic lay religious order, the Knights of Malta. Gets even more interesting the more you look into that, and I would actually recommend it. But there's so much rubbish written about the Knights Templar. There's been so many naff documentaries. Again, this is where the Arthurian stories and the Knights Templar meet. So yes, let's get on now to the Freemasonic connections with the Arthur story. This is from midnightfreemasons.org. It just came up when I was looking for Arthur legends today. It says the King Arthur effect. Last year, it was proposed to amend the constitutions of the Grand Lodge of New York to require that elected Grand Lodge officers must be past masters. Currently, someone who's merely a brother may become a Grand Master, at least in theory. The likelihood of such a nomination and election seems infinitesimal, and the potential chaos that might ensue would be great if such did happen. So maybe we should ask ourselves why it was not written that way to begin with. Perhaps there is another reason. And then they go into the legend of Arthur and the sword in the stone as an allegory for this idea that really to be an elected Grand Lodge officer, you literally have to be lucky enough to metaphorically pull the sword from the stone. In other words, you have to be chosen. So it carries on. One legend of King Arthur begins with the sword in the stone. Anyone who can pull a sword from the stone proves himself to be the rightful heir to the throne. Another may try, and hypothetically, anyone could succeed. All myths intend a purpose, be it a moral lesson or a deeper message that resonates such with the human heart that it becomes timeless and endures. Surely no well-regulated kingdom would choose someone with no pedigree or experience as a leader. Isn't that revealing about how Freemasonry works? And people are chosen. So they're selected, not elected. Yet surely no well-regulated kingdom would choose someone with no pedigree or experience as a leader. In other words, they have to be ours. They have to be chosen. So what's the message? It says, such a thing is not a matter of jurisprudence, but a principle. It is not that this or that particular man is qualified, but that any man in general can be noble and worthy of even the highest honor, which is what they're saying, that you go through the ranks of Freemasonry and somehow you become more honorable, right? It is not simply a childish fantasy or hope, but the most potent way to pronounce belief in a true meritocracy. This timeless sentiment, refined over the years into a political virtue, was transmitted through Freemasonry to the very founding of our nation. You need not have held office to be the president. I like the way that they use that and twist it. That is so interesting and revealing, isn't it? Basically saying, well, we make it look as though anyone can pull the sword out of the stone, but they do have to be chosen, you know. Okay, so this is from the Masonic Encyclopedia. Round Table, King Arthur's Round Table. The Old English legends derived from the celebrated chronicle of the 12th century known as the Brut of England. This is where Geoffrey of Monmouth got his story, of course, say that the mythical King Arthur, who died in 542 AD of a wound received in battle, instituted a company of 24, or according to some, 12 of his principal knights, bound to appear at his court on certain solemn days and meet around a circular table, whence they called Knights of the Round Table. So this is going back into just bits of myth and legend. There's no foundation to what they're saying here. It says Arthur is said to have been the institutor of those military and religious orders of chivalry, which afterwards became so common in the Middle Ages. Into the order which he established, none were admitted but those who had given proofs of their valour, and the knights were bound to defend widows, maidens, and children, to relieve the distressed, maintain the Christian religion, contribute to the support of the church, protect pilgrims, advance honour, and suppress vice, which, of course, is the front aims of the Porch Masons in Freemasonry. So again, the Arthur story is being used. The chivalrous knight, that's what we profess to be. They were to administer to the care of soldiers wounded in the service of their country and bury those who died, to ransom captives, deliver prisoners, and record all noble enterprises for the honour and renown of the noble order. So they're comparing Freemasonry to the Knights of the Round Table. King Arthur and his knights have been very generally considered by scholars as mythical, notwithstanding that many years ago, Whitaker, in his History of Manchester, attempted to establish the fact of his existence and to separate the true from the fabulous in this history. The legend has been used by some of the fabricators of irregular degrees in Freemasonry. So we can look at some of the Illuminati orders. Maybe we can look at the Order of the Rocroi, the Martinists, and the work of Martinez de Pasquale, the magical theurgical branches of Freemasonry, and the Arthur story will be in there too. So what they're saying is fabricators of irregular degrees in Freemasonry. Yet, on the other hand, and on another Freemasonic website, they're saying, well, it's a good front for us too. It's quite interesting and revealing, isn't it? So, yes, that was from bricksmasons.com, if you want to know, bricksmasons.com. So now we get to the Holy Grail and Templar Freemasonry. And this is very, very big imagery in the City of London from the 17th century onwards, of course, when the first lodge was announced. Well, we know that we have the Regius manuscript from 1390. That was the first Freemasonic document which said that Freemasonry had been in Britain from the time of good King Athelstan, which was, I think, around 900 AD. So Freemasonry's also been around a lot longer. So we can see the King Arthur story in Freemasonry as actually growing up together. Interesting, isn't it? So what happened to the Holy Grail after the Templars' trial? This is the story. Well, did they have the Holy Grail? No, probably not. But this is part of the Knights Templar, the Templar Freemasonry, is that they had the Holy Grail. There we get the Rosslyn Chapel stories. We get all this stuff that went into the British aristocracy, which they love to talk about. I've talked to these aristocrats. They love the King Arthur thing because it makes them look good. It also gives them mystery. It gives them a background. It gives them a mystique. In fact, I know somebody who was talking to one of the Sinclairs in a pub in London. And my friend is actually quite convincing about talking about this stuff. And my friend says to him, he says, I know all about Rosslyn Chapel. And this guy ran out of the pub. So they have a deep kind of respect, and not, it's beyond respect, belief in the supernatural surrounding this stuff, which actually does make it very interesting, especially when you think of it as some kind of steering mechanism for monarchy and for the Freemasons and for Templar Freemasonry. So it says, what happened to the Holy Grail after the Templars' trial? This again is from the Freemasonic website I've just been talking to about. There are two theories concerning that. the north or the south. The first assumes that the Grail was taken to a secret fortress in Paris, but after the King of France turned on them, they then sent it to Scotland. Now, this does get interesting, doesn't it? Because if we look at Scotland, it's important, especially with the Scottish rite of Freemasonry, the covering up of the history of Scotland, Edinburgh being Jerusalem, all of that good stuff, which I think has some foundation evidence. And I don't ask anybody to believe that, because they'd have to go through the stuff I've gone through and looked at. And really, this is for people to make their own mind up about. But I like things that start to make sense, stories that have narratives that fit. And that's where it gets interesting. It says the latter presumes that the Templars took the Grail to Portugal. So they're saying that it was sent to Scotland or Portugal. And that's interesting, because obviously the Templars were massive in Portugal and Spain, but more in Portugal. When I was in Portugal, in Sintra, the Temple of Freemasonry is really powerful there. And the magical side of it is very present. So this King Arthur story in places like Portugal, it kind of goes into the background, because the mystery around the Temple of Freemasonry is everywhere. And still very prominent in Portugal. Of course, Portugal is on the same timeline as Britain. It's kind of got this ancient historical connection to Britain. Of course, we've never gone to war with Portugal, and it's kind of twinned. It's kind of twinned in a way with Britain through trading. Was obviously not so much anymore with the EU and all this stuff, but that's globalism. So it says, regardless of what we know today about the Holy Grail and its connection to the Knights Templar, whether it's truth or legend, it's still an essential element of medieval history and popular culture. It has inspired many famous books and movies, notably the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. So here it comes full circle, and we're back literally to square one. The allegory, the mystery, the hiding behind mythology when you can't get to the central point. And that is what a lot of this is about. And that is my problem with it, that the King Arthur story, the legend, has been used to cover up so much, and also to ridicule other stories, such as the Christian origins of Britain. This history that we've been covering from the Druids, going into the time of Joseph of Arimathea and the early stories of Christ, which we covered in our show on Albion a few weeks ago. So that's where I find the real mystery. The King Arthur legend, as I say, has never fascinated me that much, because I knew they were stories. They interested me. I thought they were good stories, but they don't fascinate me. They don't resonate with me. I'd like to know what you think about that, because I've given you, in some respects, my view of what I think about it. But really, I've just given you sources along with a couple of my own anecdotes. So I don't sway people with my beliefs. I try and give it the factual basis and the timeline that it actually deserves. So yes, if in summary, the King Arthur story, to romanticize the monarchy, to popularize the Middle Eastern Templar Wars from Constantine in 325 AD, of course, the relocation of Christianity. When we look at what the Templar Wars were about, then we can get another view on this. Really, it's been used as a front for usury and banking also. And of course, the money goes to Switzerland, Malta, and the City of London, and the places of global power. Very, very interesting, the whole thing. So there is this mythical side of this financial system, the Knights Templar, and their using of the Arthur story, I think, is very convenient for them to hoodwink the public. So that's my conclusion. It's been very good for war propaganda, and we have always been given these heroes to reinforce the governing system and to give us hopium. Remember, Arthur was going to rise again as King of the Britons, and we all would like to see something like that happen. So this romanticized history resonates with us because, in a way, it is in the DNA of the people. That's what's clever about it. So we have to differentiate the myth from the reality. Who benefits and where do we want to go? So hope you enjoyed that, and do let me know what you think. info@windowsontheworld.net is the best place to email me. Let me know also what you think about having the show on Sunday or Monday. I'm finding it more convenient with these longer shows to do them on Monday, but we're always live 8 p.m. GMT, Sunday, windowsontheworld.net, and it's there in our Spreaker archive and here on our YouTube channel. And if there's a change in that, I always announce it. So thanks a lot, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope it's the basis for further revelation, information, and research. Thanks a lot. I'm going to have a look at the comments now.